At this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kathy Yancey and Terry Rhodes to take us through the workshop.
And thank you very much, Rachel. You've done a great setup, and everyone should see a slide presentation. Am I correct on that? Yep. Good, excellent. And you can see then that what we'll be doing in this slideshow is talking about everything you wanted to know about scoring guides, but were afraid to ask. I am happily presenting here today with my friend and colleague, Terry Rhodes. We've known each other for a long time and have done lots of different kinds of work together. So it's a pleasure to work with him again. And I want to thank Rachel as well, who's making all the technology work. And I especially want to thank both of them because they're both sick. They will not infect us because they're at a distance, good news, but they are going above and beyond the call of duty. I also want to say there are some people on the call that I know, and I'm glad to see them, and then people that I don't know, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you. What we're going to do today is pretty much what we promised in our blurb. So I hope you won't be surprised to find that we're going to begin by outlining benefits of scoring guides. We're going to review some portfolio scoring guides, 4 in specific, I should say. And as Rachel indicated, those are available in the chat, so you'll want to download those. At one point in the session, we're going to go to breakout rooms very briefly, where you'll have a chance to talk about 2 of those guides. And I'm going to walk you through those guides before you do that, so you'll be very well prepared for that exercise. Then when we come back from that, we'll be discussing their strengths and weaknesses. No guide is perfect. They do different things. They construct different kinds of students. They present different kinds of opportunities. So we'll be thinking about those together. And then what we'll do is shift to thinking about how we revise both guides and assignments so that we have alignment between them and so they do what we want them to do. The object here then is not to provide you with a guide that will do what you want it to do, but to really think about guide making and how that works and how you can create a guide that works best for your situation. But one thing before we go ahead, we're a small enough group. We've got, I think something, last time I checked, we had 20 participants. If you've got questions that you'd like us to address, if you would want to flag those now, we'd be glad to make a note of those. You can either speak up, unmute yourself and share that way, or you can share in the chat and I'll check it when we have a bit of a break, but we'd be glad to try to take up any questions that you have that you know that you're bringing to the session now. So anybody want to identify some?
Jillian asked a question in the chat whether the guides were closed captioned, and they're not.
Oh, no, I was just asking if they were CC licensed.
Oh, CC licensed, great. No.
Yeah, so they could be adapted or not.
I believe they can. They're all publicly accessible.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
All of the things I know that I'll be using have permission. We have permission to use and disseminate. So.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? All right, hearing none, I'm going to move on. And I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Terry.
Thank you, Kathy. And again, let me start real briefly with apologizing. I don't have COVID, which I'm very thankful for, but I do have a horrendous cold that is sinus-based, and it's therefore affecting my speaking, and you may also get some unwelcome coughing on occasion. But I'm going to forge ahead. And I'll also say that some of you I do know, as Kathy said, some I'm meeting for the first time. I used to work at the American Association of Colleges and Universities, and I will be referencing some of their materials and resources, not only because I worked on many of them in the development of them, but because they still seem to actually be useful for people to look at. And again, it's not because I'm saying these are the be all end all, because they're not, but they've been developed through a process that Portfolio is particularly in alignment with, which is a community of practice and a community of effort that has been behind all of that work so that it could be used and adapted and adopted in ways that made the most sense. And this slide It's just really to go back in time to an earlier point when assessment became something that came into the conversation. And when e-portfolios were evolving, there was indeed a rather strong dialogue around whether portfolios could be used for assessment, where we created a database, and it was primarily accountability that it was designed for, versus the e-portfolio that was illuminating the student learning growth development, that it was really about student learning and trying to enhance that. You can go on, Kathy. The point here is that it's not a dichotomy. And indeed, portfolios that we now have and the guides, the scoring guides that are being developed and are pervasive now, actually move these things into a continuum, really, that interplays as people move through it. And the usefulness of the guide is that it is about shared understanding. It's also about talking about how do we move from simple bare minimum to quality standards, quality performances, quality work that we're looking for students to be able to present regardless of where the students are. And that means we have to focus on the work that the students do, not in a punitive way, but in a way where both the student, their peers, can engage in talking about what's good, what's bad, what's strong, what's weak, what's communicative, what isn't, but also with faculty and others in our communities that we interact with can be sharing, have rational discussions, and to also deal with grades. I mean, it's dealing with the reality that as faculty, we're not only trying to enhance learning, but we also are supposed to be providing grades, and grades are metrics that are critically important to our students, to ourselves, to our institutions, to workplaces, et cetera. But we also generate information that allows us to evaluate what we do well, what we can improve on, where we need to focus our attention. Next, please. This is a sort of a shorthand leaning ladder of scoring guides, and to try to show this arc of the ways in which portfolios are now appearing and being utilized, and as they've grown and developed. And one can think about these as nesting, or you can view them as being standalone. I see them as linked, and that's the point here about talking about scoring guides too, is that guides need to be able to help us with both individual artifacts or assignments through departments, colleges, institutions, systems to beyond. And I've made some notes to sort of illustrate some of those places, but it's student learning and accountability are indeed coexistent, and they're dependent upon each other. And if we focus primarily on student learning, which is the ultimate goal, we will have everything we need for the accountability. Next, please.
It doesn't want to go next.
Doesn't want to go next?
There you go.
Yeah, there we go. So why guides or rubrics? Well, again, this is a restatement of things, but it brings the accountability as well as the learning. But the one at the bottom, the oval at the bottom is analysis, understanding of student learning to help us as learners, to help us as faculty and our learning goals as well, institutions, and for employers and those outside of the academy who we don't communicate what we do with very often very well. Next, please. So what the portfolio does, the e-portfolio, is to give us all of these opportunities to do the things that were in that leaning ladder of looking at different levels at different times and different spaces. The learning is something that doesn't happen in one class, in one assignment. And if we're doing our jobs, if we're not doing our jobs, we're missing that point. Doing our jobs means that if we focus on those key performances, those assignments, those pieces that we ask students to do solely individually as episodic things, we've lost our ability to integrate and to enhance learning over time, to reflect upon how we've grown and developed. Scoring guides, I also throw in here rubrics. AAC&U tends to use the term rubrics with this. We can begin to try to help our students as well, because they're often the most resistant to some of this, to see learning as indeed a process that doesn't stop when you turn the paper in. It doesn't stop when you move to the next class or when you go on vacation. And that we can use it as a diagnostic approach to see the things that both resonate with us individually. How can we then build from that? And the things that don't make sense to us, i.e. the things that we may want to inquire about and explore more into the future. And it helps us, particularly I think as educators, to not constantly separate and put barriers between the curriculum, the co-curriculum, and the extracurricular things, but rather bring those together because they all provide learning opportunities. And if we see them as learning opportunities, we as faculty have really increased our ability to reach and to influence student learning development. Next, please. Two people who have been instrumental, I think, in this whole evolution and merging in ways of portfolios and rubrics and scoring, et cetera, are Mary Taylor Huber and Pat Hutchings, who were at the Carnegie Institute for many, many years, is the integration. So much of what has happened in medicine and in our society over the last several decades has been to get us into smaller and smaller pieces, into more and more discrete instances and things, and to separate things and to create channels where you can find all the things that are the same, find the people that are all the same, rather than trying to integrate the things to help understand the difference, to make sense of those, et cetera. And if we don't do that in higher education, where we have the most opportunity to do that in formal education, again, we're missing an opportunity that's there. And this is back in 2005 in a book that they put out, and it's still more true than ever now. Next, please. And so that is exactly how guides and rubrics define themselves, or at least it's a foundational definition of what they are about. They're not about right, wrong, yes, no, but about the understanding and the dispositions for students to build their habits of mind, to make the connections. And then as they move through and mature, because part of this is a maturation thing, to begin to synthesize and to transfer learning experiences into new settings, et cetera. Next, please. Again, I told you I was going to come back to AAC&U. They condensed this into a set of essential learning outcomes. But again, the thing I want to point out here is not that they have the be-all end-all list, but rather what they were trying to do was to say, yes, knowledge is important, content is important, we can't ignore that, but that it's how we think about, approach and think about using knowledge in these different categories, both intellectually, practically, and our personal social responsibility parts of our lives. Again, about integrating these things, making sense and peace of these things in our own lives and the lives of others. But it's not just the stuff, but it's about the practice of them, the process that's there. And so it was a important part of learning that said there are outcomes to this, and those outcomes are going to emerge and grow and mature as students and we move through our lives. Next, please. And so what AAC&U had done is move into what they call rubrics. They're very similar to guides, and we'll see that in just 1 minute. But again, just the basics of this, rubrics or guides typically have criteria, basic things that they're looking at and focusing on: connection to experience, connection to discipline in this case. Next, please. And next, I think there's another arrow there. It's behind my pictures, I think, yeah.
It's behind your picture, but it's there.
Yeah, levels of this, so that we know that we are actually making progress. We're moving from A to Z kind of thing. And again, once more, the last one is the actual performance description, the thing that says, and this is what we look for, this is what it seems to represent it to us when we, as faculty in particular, because it is a little faculty centric, and we're going to talk a bit about the student centric and the faculty centric pieces of this, to say what it is that we focus on, help students understand these are the things that we're going to look for so that they have a clue about that. Next, please. So now we're going to look at some guides.
Yes, we are. And the question is then, how does all this translate? What the insight and wisdom that Terry shared with us, how does this translate into scoring guides for portfolios? And what we'll do is look, as I promised at the beginning, at 4 examples. I will walk you through those examples and point out different aspects of them before then asking you to join a breakout group and discuss 2 of them with 2 questions in mind. So here's the first one. This one comes from the Stanford Notation in Science Communication program that Helen Chen, a luminary in the ePortfolio world, has led. And that program has 2 courses that bookend the science communication program. One where students create a portfolio, and the second bookend where they complete the portfolio with science and writing courses in between. This is a holistic scoring guide, meaning that you get 1 score and that's all you get. It's either a pass or a fail. It's not analytic. What we saw, what Terry just showed us with the integrative learning is analytic because it's broken into various pieces, so you can comment on different dimensions. In a holistic scoring guide, you cannot. And you can see here that a portfolio that's going to pass as a whole includes the cover letter, the artifacts, the artifact reflection. So it's a full, rich portfolio. It demonstrates a high level of proficiency and expertise in science communication and a consistent achievement of the notation's learning outcomes. And you'll see that one theme across these guides is consistency of achievement. The cover letter provides a coherent and compelling framework for the ePortfolio, reflecting on the student's development as a versatile and effective science communicator and offering sufficient evidence to support individual claims. So it is an evidence-based activity, and it is up to the students to identify that evidence. Artifact reflection. So you've got one reflection in that framework that speaks to the whole of portfolio, and then you have reflections on the separate artifacts. So artifact reflections articulate the rhetorical situation of the document, and more specifically, how artifacts demonstrate achievement of the notation's learning outcomes. Artifacts represent a range of genres, modes, and contexts of communicating scientific information and engage in translating and communicating science to a range of audiences, specialist and non-specialist. Individual artifacts illustrate effective use of appropriate and effective science communication strategies. So it's fairly straightforward. There's a pass or a no pass. You can see that the whole is important, that the consistency of the artifacts is important, that the artifacts represent a range of genres, modes, and contexts. You couldn't have just a single item repeated. That the range of audience is important. Students have to be able to speak to specialists, but they have to be able to explain to a layperson as well. And so some aspects of this guide that you might want to think about, there's not a lot of range. So students, it is a dichotomy. It's either they're passing or they're not passing. Now, you might say that in this model, you probably don't need a lot of range. I mean, the fact is they're at Stanford, they're all science students. You probably don't have a lot of range. So a little bit of range here is probably appropriate. To give you an idea of what range can look like, in the AP exams, they have a range of 9. That's a lot of range, okay? Whether we would even need 9 in AP is a different question, but that's a lot of range. Here you have very little range, of the least amount of range you could possibly have. The idea of consistent performance, which I said is going to show up again. So the whole and the parts, that's I'm not sure back in the day when rubrics and guides were first created, whole and parts was part of it, but that does seem to be consistent, as you'll see. And then, of course, if it's a holistic guide and it's either a pass or a no pass, it's easier to get reliability than if you're trying to get some sort of benchmark score on any number of dimensions. So if reliability is important to you, something that has little range and is holistic is simply easier in that regard. So that's number one. Number two comes from University of Buffalo. It's their general education capstone e-portfolio. Now, this is a very different model. It's a STEM-friendly institution, has a lot of students of color, almost 30% of the students are transfer students, just FYI, a lot of first-gen students. They revised their general education program maybe 5 years ago or so. And the students basically have selected pathways that they choose. They begin their portfolio in two settings, a foundation seminar and a first-year composition course. And then it culminates in a 1-credit capstone. So that's what you have here. And there are several interesting aspects of this particular model, which, as I say, does something entirely different than the Stanford model. The first thing I'll point out is that if you look on the side, on the left side, you'll see that for every outcome, like connecting relevant experience and academic knowledge and evolving sense of self as a learning, for every one of those, underneath that, there's sources of evidence. So you can see exactly what evidence counts for any given. See, there's a source of evidence. So if you look at that first one, the sources of evidence for articulate connection would be the thematic and global integrative essay. So that's where students are supposed to go to get their evidence. As you look at the sources of evidence, as you go down the guide, you'll find that some of the sources of evidence are beyond the classroom. The students are actually required to include some evidence from beyond the classroom, and it can be co-curricular activity, it can be volunteer activity, it can be workplace activity, it can be personal activity. But beyond the classroom is a really important aspect of this particular model. You'll also see that one of the dimensions is evolving of itself as an evolving learner, which you don't see in every guide, I have to say. And another is that where it's eventually going is to encourage students to become digital citizens. And in order to demonstrate that, students have to show that they are capable in terms of their digital capabilities. So that's a pretty interesting dimension. And the other thing is at the top. So this is an interesting thing in a scoring guide. You don't see this all the time. A lot of times in scoring guides, what people try to do is create a guide where the benchmarks look very different, or at least somewhat different from grading. Here, to my mind, it looks a lot like grading. So if you go all the way over to the right, you can see it's 100%, and 85, which would be sort of a B, 70, which would be sort of a C, 60, which would be sort of a D, and then 0. So this seems to be sort of calibrated to grades, which I think is sort of an interesting decision. And it would be good to know for them how well that has worked. If you'd like, I'd be happy to ask them because I'm in contact with them about some other matters, and it would be a good question to ask. I don't think you'll see anything like that in many other guides. And then I want to make some final comments about this one. The sources of evidence, that's really interesting, and that's also very unusual. It's unusual in that most models to date are not that capacious in terms of their openness to evidence. And it's also unusual in that the sources of evidence are not usually identified in the guide. So that's an interesting aspect to think about. The levels that are like grades, that's a second thing. The whole and parts, if you go through it, you'll see again, they're interested in whole and parts. The last source of evidence at the bottom, for example, is the whole of the e-portfolio. And then the beyond the classroom component is very interesting. So now we'll look at a third. This one is out of St. Olaf, which is a small liberal arts school up in Minnesota, as you're probably aware. This model comes out of a very unusual program because it comes out of the Center for Integrative Learning, which allows students to design their own majors, and their majors tend to operate at the intersection of two different disciplines. So for instance, it might be that you're that one of their earlier portfolios, this was really back in the day, would have been around 2004, 2005. One of their earliest one was at the intersection of geography and mathematical modeling, which when you think about it makes a certain amount of sense, but the student had to design it to get to it. So the students in this particular model have to do a couple of things. The portfolio, as you can see, promotes the 4 goals of liberal learning. And those are 4 goals of liberal learning that are important to all students at St. Olaf. So this is not specific to the ePortfolio. Those 4 goals, as you can see, are recognizing connections, being reflective about intellectual and personal growth, building intellectual community, and building bridges to communities outside the academy. But on top of that, they also have specific outcomes for the ePortfolio. And you can see them listed there. I'm going to point out a couple things to you about them. Here, got the 4 goals of liberal learning then. So the meaningful coherence of the whole and the quality of the individual pages. Again, whole and parts, as we've seen before. They're very interested in links. Their perception is that electronic links provide a terrific mechanism for connecting disparate pieces of information and building new kinds of coherence. So they're very interested in the degree to which the rationale for particular links is explicit. And they're also very interested in the critical judgment apparent in the selection of external sites. So you cannot simply arbitrarily include a site. It has to connect in some meaningful way to the portfolio that the student has created. And then the last item here is the extent of the ePortfolio. That's very interesting because it has to do with the ambition of the ePortfolio. And so one that is less ambitious is going to be at something of a disadvantage than one that's more ambitious. And then the portfolio's overall aesthetic quality, which would be in some way aligned with the content of the self-designed major. Now, the last thing I want to say, but it's a really important thing, is that I have turned this into a scoring guide. All these criteria belong to St. Olaf, but they don't actually lay it out as a scoring guide. I laid it out as a scoring guide so we could see what it would look like in a scoring guide. And you can see that I made it a holistic scoring guide and I just added more range. So instead of there being, like a pass and a no pass, you have some range here with a no pass at a 1 and a high, pretty high pass at a 4. And I did that precisely to demonstrate changing some of these dimensions, what difference that makes. And then again, I've got some comments on different aspects of this. So you have more range here than you did in the Stanford model. I see this as a plus model. And I'm going to use plus in 2 ways. Because I'm going to use it in a different way in the last guide. It's a plus model in the sense that the students are responsible for the outcomes that apply to all St. Olaf students, all of those having to do with connections and community. But on top of that, because they're working in the ePortfolio, they have to demonstrate some other competencies as well. So I see that as a plus model. Again, you have the emphasis on whole and parts. Linkiness is central to this. If you don't have a fair number of links that make lots of different kinds of connections, you'll be at something of a disadvantage. And the extent of the model, that's unusual to see the extent of the model, but I think it's a fair thing to ask. And we certainly reward extent in other kinds of projects. So it's an interesting, I think, dimension. And this is Loyola. This is a completely different model because this comes out of a Center for Engaged Learning, where students engage in a service learning project. And you can see that there are it's a much simpler model. There are only 3 outcomes, and there are really only 2. The range is small. It's really does not meet or partially meets or meets expectations. But there is a kind of bonus here. This is the other kind of bonus, where you can exceed expectations. There are some other portfolio models that have done that. Back in the day, this was in the 90s, Eckerd College had a writing portfolio, it was a print portfolio that used this model exactly, exceeding expectations, and it got a commendation from SACS, which is its accrediting region. Similar situation at Washington State University, where exceeds expectations. And the reason that the accrediting agencies liked it is that they felt that there was no ceiling then for strong students. There was that students who are not quite so strong were not bound by exceeding expectations, but the ones who were stronger would have someplace else to go. The other thing that's interesting, if you look at this one closely, which you might do in the breakout room, is that exceeding expectations in general either asks for, in the first two dimensions, it asks for a deeper, richer understanding. But what's really interesting to me is in the last one, where the last outcome is connect, engage, learning to Loyola University Chicago mission. The student, to exceed expectation there, has to put something into action. So it's not just understanding, it's actually taking action, which I think is pretty interesting. So you have the synthesis through reflection, which is a pretty welcome kind of outcome, related experience to development. So it really does look on development. It's not achievement oriented, it's really developmentally oriented. But it's also interesting because it connects so specifically to the Loyola mission. So in that sense, it's definitely an institutional specific model, but I've seen some other institutional missions that do something of the same thing. So that mission obviously would be adjusted if you had a somewhat different mission. So a couple of dimensions here I would highlight. It's a scoring plus model because it's got exceeds expectations. It's interested in development much more than it's interested in achievement, and it's really linked to the institutional mission. So those are the four guides that we're going to ask you to think about. You're going to have about 10 minutes in a breakout room, and Rachel's going to help us assemble into breakout rooms. And I'm going to ask you to choose two guides, any two. So Stanford, Buffalo, St. Olaf, or Loyola. So choose any two for comparative purposes. Which would you choose to work with as a student? And I know that's hard to do. I want you to take off your faculty hat or your staff hat. I want you to put on a student hat. Try to remember what it's like, or was like for you to be a student, or what it's like to be a student now. And if that's too hard, think about a student that you've been working with. Which one would that student prefer? Think about that a little bit. And then of course, which do you prefer as a staff or faculty member? And again, why? And when we return, we'll again walk our way through these and talk about what we see as the advantages and disadvantages of each, not because we're settled on any one of them, but because that will help us understand how we might design our own. So with that, I'm going to ask Rachel to arrange us.
Kathy, before I open the rooms, there were a few questions in the chat. Did you?
Sure. I'm sorry I didn't, but I'm happy to try and should I get to them now?
I'll read them to you and you can let me know what you think. One was asking if the guide that had the sources would be considered signature assignments, specifically the thematic integrative essays.
No, that's a good question, and they're not signature assignments.
And then, or if sources of evidence are mentioned, they might be part of the scales, is what I've typically seen. That's what somebody else said. And then is this St. Olaf example in it, would a pass expect the first section only, or also excellence? Or how would the numeric range relate to the quality descriptors?
Well, so what happens in practice with St. Olaf is that the students have, they're arranged much like an undergraduate thesis, or even a thesis committee for that matter, where students have a committee. And their committee decides whether the student has passed or not. And I think in any situation like this, there's always going to be some slippage. And that's why consistency is mentioned so often, is to try to eliminate some of that slippage. So that's a great question.
All right. Well, I will go ahead and open, we're going to do 4 breakout rooms, and it should pop up for you to join that breakout room. And then Kathy and Terry, you should have the ability, if you go down to either it popped up automatically or go down to more breakout rooms, and you should be able to go like back and forth between the rooms if you'd like, or you can stay here.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah.
And we'll come back in just 10 minutes.
10 minutes. I'll set a timer.
So welcome back. We've got the rooms are all closed, right? Okay. So this is the first one. This is the Stanford one. And we might want to talk about well, let's start with this. Did anybody talk about this one? Yeah.
We did
Okay.
briefly. I just shared that from an instructional point of view, I thought that would be great just to say pass or fail. And I also even from the student point of view, I think if this was just like for a course portfolio assessment, it's very clear as to what's expected. So I don't think, I don't know if students would kind of prefer some more wiggle room than pass or fail, but I do think they know exactly what they need to do in order to pass or fail. And from the instructional point of view too, if it's not there, then it's not there.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I want to make the point that at least for the three of these that are sort of strictly academic, so that's the Stanford, the Buffalo, and the St. Olaf, all those students get a lot of support. So it's not like somebody just says to them, go away and create a portfolio. In point of fact, I mean, in this model, there is a specific ePortfolio course that opens the program, then students are taking other classes. Then there's an ePortfolio course that closes the program. And I should say that course that closes at the culminating, the sort of capstone, if you will, students invite faculty for a showcase event where faculty get to see it. So you've got a lot of pieces there that are supports that are built into it. But the other thing is that there's some real audiences for it. It's not like the portfolio is just created and then, housed on the web and that's the end of it. In point of fact, that each student has to ask somebody that they've worked with in a writing or communication context and someone they've worked with in a science context to come and take a look at them at a shared showcase event. So, and again, I mean, when you look at programs that thrive, ePortfolio programs that thrive, that's part of what they do. They have showcase events. They have real audiences. There's a live part of it. It's not all online. So that's, go ahead.
Sorry. So is that an intervention point then, so that there can be iteration after? So if they do this presentation and they get feedback that they really should change these things, or this might not meet the criteria, they can do that?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't. Well, this actually comes out of I edited a book called ePortfolio as Curriculum, and this comes out of a chapter in that was authored by Helen Chen and some of her colleagues and friends. And there was not any discussion of that. I can imagine that students might choose to revise on their own. But I don't know that I wouldn't be able to say that was part of the model. I'll also say that the program is by application only. And I expect that the students who enter the program are probably pretty well qualified. And I would also suspect that they're very well motivated. I mean, these are students who really care about communication. And I will say that the examples that they have on the web, as well as the examples that Helen and her colleagues shared in the chapter, were students who were really firing on all synapses. They were volunteering, they were strong students, and actually the challenge for them in some parts was, and this is a challenge that we've heard from other students today, and I've heard from other students in other programs, is making the connections. How do you, I mean, I know who I am in this context, I know who I am in this other context, but how do you, I mean, you don't quite see it here, but another way that this program talks about itself and what they want students to do is to create a defining story. What's the story here of who you are? How do you bring the disparate pieces of you together? And if you heard the portfolio panel, the student panel that just preceded this session, students talked about that as well, that, that they welcome the opportunity to bring disparate pieces of them together, but that it's also a challenge too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's kind of just something that came up in our breakout room right off the bat is something that you touched on, is the idea of these e-portfolio prep courses.
Mhm.
And those of us who are discussing it, we don't have such a thing. We just have programs, courses or programs where e-portfolios are a component. I would assume that e-portfolio implementations would be that much more successful if you offered those types of courses.
It's relatively new, and the reason that I edited the book is that I wanted, because I thought there was enough activity in that sphere that we could collect it, and then we would have something to think with about what that kind of curriculum looked like. And it isn't always offered in a course. Sometimes it's offered in other places, but a 1 credit course, a 0 credit course, a half credit course is one way to give attention to this. And I'm encouraged, by the other courses that I've heard about. So yeah, no, you're exactly right. Any other comments on this before we move ahead?
Just really briefly, unlike the Buffalo model, this actually points to the components of the e-portfolio through which the student will be assessed, sort of the learning goals, if you will. It's just embedded in a paragraph, and it's not as detailed as a Buffalo model, but I like that it has that. I like that about both of the rubrics. So.
And we talked here about this one because I visited with your group, Annette, and we talked about this one as being very, very explicit in a way that the others aren't entirely, and that being explicit might be particularly important for models where students, where you have a lot of students, a large N, right? So in other words, in the St. Olaf model, it's a very small N, it's a limited number of students. They're working closely with their committees. Here, you've got thousands and thousands of students, 30% of whom, as I indicated, are transfer students. So they didn't take the foundational course. They didn't take the first writing course where they started. They're going to have to start in medias res. And where the N is larger, it may be that we really do need to have something that is much more explicit. Yeah. Other comments about this one that anybody would want to make? All right, well then let's go to the next one, which is St. Olaf. We like this one, we didn't like this one.
Our group didn't like this one. We thought it was
Okay.
very, very, very vague.
Okay, so it's too vague.
Too general. It would be difficult both from the instructional point of view and from the student point of view of what is expected.
Okay. Now that's interesting. Let me ask you one question, because another observation that was made in the breakout group that I visited had to do with faculty liking things to be vague and students wanting things to be nailed down. Did you have any conversation around that at all?
We did, but I think the people that we had in the group were more prone to wanting the things to be explicit from the instructional point of view as well, right? Yeah. Like taking more of that student perspective. So yes, I get that whole idea. We were talking about, yes, it would be, when you have these very specific values that instead of a 4 or a 5, you maybe want to do a 4.5. Yeah. And whether you can do that, but that's kind of it, I think.
Yeah. So that's, and the comments in the chat, it's more about characteristics than quality of descriptions. I think that's fair enough. And one other point I want to get, that, let's see, there's one down here if I can get to it. A lot of interpretation for any stakeholder, and I think that's fair. I'll also say, though, I want to go back to something else. It's true, it is a lot of interpretation, but I'll also point out that any scoring guide that you use is going to require interpretation. No matter how much you nail it down, it's still an interpretive and evaluative act. I mean, there's just no way of getting around that, which is unfortunate, but that's the way it is. But one way to make the interpretation less not arbitrary, because I'm not sure interpretations are always arbitrary, but seemingly subjective, is to have models. And St. Olaf does have a very nice gallery. If you haven't seen it, you might want to do that. If you just Google St. Olaf ePortfolio Gallery, it will take you there. And that gallery tends to show you what it brings to life, what these abstractions actually mean. And that's true for all of them. I mean, there's just no question about it. If you really want to see what excellence looks like, or what somewhat less than excellence looks like, looking at some of these is actually the way to do it. In fact, if we were in person, I would have suggested running this workshop a somewhat different way, where we actually looked at some portfolios and applied these scoring guides. That would have been really helpful. That seemed a little difficult to manage in the time that we had, and in the modality that we're using. But I think your point is well taken. More interpretation is required for this than it is for the Buffalo model. But I'd simply say that they all require some interpretation. So, other comments or questions? All right, then I'll go to the last, which is the Loyola model. Any comments on that?
Just raised in our group that I think students might balk at the whole idea of exceeding expectations and what that means and how far do we have to go. And I think faculty like it, and it potentially motivates a growth mindset or something. But so that was one of my concerns.
No, I think it's fair enough. It's sort of, because it exceeds expectations. On the one hand, it seems to be kind of ratcheting down on trying to make things very competitive at the same time that it's making things very competitive. Because if you don't get it exceeds expectations, it could feel as though you're failing, which is not the intent, But I will say, one of I mentioned this before, I'll just return to it briefly. I appreciate the fact that in that last outcome of connecting engaged learning to the institutional mission, students are required to put into action the mission, because it seems to me that at the end of the day, what we're looking for is for students to put into action. So I think that's an important outcome. And maybe one thing we might think about is how we could build that into a more conventional model. So, other comments or questions? All right, well then I'm going to turn it over to Terry, who's going to help us understand how we can revise so that we've got our assignments and our rubrics in alignment.
Hopefully. Next slide, please. I am coming back to this notion of the integrative learning. And again, what you hopefully will see here is many of the things that came out of the discussions in the breakout rooms about aspects of what people were looking for in a guide in terms of connections, is connecting previous learning and new learning, that constantly context that needs to be created, that ability to connect it for the student to see a connection to what she or he is doing, etc. The real world problems. I would with the Loyola one say that the last example that Kathy was using, the action part is important, but wouldn't we expect the action to be there earlier? In terms of, shouldn't action be more explicit if that's going to be one of the key aspects of that in the doesn't engage in action, or it meets what would our expectation be for the actions to be occurring? So it's that connection, though, to real world problems, to doing something about it is there. And it really is about what it is we're trying to create in terms of our students' perceptions and about their learning and themselves. Can they adapt? Can they make these connections over time? And so it also then includes the more on the right-hand side in terms of some of the more academic things, et cetera. But it's the language of our guides, our rubrics, helps convey a message in and of themselves to what's important for our students. And the other thing I think that came through in those most of the examples that Kathy was presenting is the emphasizing what the student does rather than what the students are not doing. And so again, it gives you something to build upon so that the student can say, oh yeah, this is good. Meets expectation is good. Going beyond expectation, let's explore that. Let's see how that can get accomplished. Next, please. This is the awkward part of, of this sharing thing. And again, I apologize because my computer was died. But anyway, so assignments, how do we connect this then to the assignments? Because the assignments are the things that provoke all these artifacts and things that we're looking at and asking students to include in one way or another. The assignment is influential in the things that go into the e-portfolio. The design of that assignment is indeed critical. And it's not so much about, I know as a faculty member, I did a little bit of obsessing about, did I have a good assignment? It isn't about whether it's a good or a bad assignment, but whether or not it actually aligns with the learning that you're looking for. Does it result in that type of learning when you give this assignment to students, in whatever the context happens to be? And so that's really what I want to spend a little bit of time doing now, is walking you through an example. And I did not include this on the slide, but I'll tell you, some of you may know this faculty member, but Bonnie Orcutt, who's at Worcester State University in Massachusetts, is really the author of this example. But I've always been really struck by both what looks like something very complicated, but is actually fairly simple, I think. And I want to walk us through it fairly quickly. This is an assignment. She teaches economics at Worcester State. And this is an assignment that she gave to her students. And that's the entirety of it. It's got very well organized and so on and so forth. One could say it's a very good assignment if you wanted to talk about it in that way. But it's dealing with looking at a source of news and data and asking students then to focus on aspects of this. But she was not satisfied when she got students' work as a result of this assignment. And so she started out thinking that the main focus of this was about quantitative literacy. And so she pulled out, again, I'm told you my bias here, the AAC&U quantitative literacy rubric / scoring guide, and said, let me interrogate my assignment with the scoring guide. Next one, please. So again, this is text heavy, and I'm not asking you to read this. The slides will be available if you want to read it. And we can I can make these available so that you can access them in PDF forms and stuff after this. But what she did is she took down that left-hand side the criteria from the scoring guide. And you can see those things laid out. But then she asked a couple questions to interrogate this. And again, she was after here a habit of mind. She was after a practice, developing a practice in her students. The criterion is addressed in the assignment and the assignment's grading rubric. there's a distinction here between the scoring guide and the grading rubric. And so scoring guides tend to be a bit more meta in their approach. But grading rubrics are also something that are critically important. Students are very much interested in those things. And faculty are indeed supposed to be producing grades at the end of this. And those two things can be in conflict. What she's talking about here is how do these things perhaps fit together, and how does the assignment interact with them? The third column over is, was this taught? Was this part of what was taught in the course instruction? And so again, I know as a faculty member, I didn't often think about whether or not I covered everything. And indeed, I figured I wouldn't cover everything in my course instruction. But the things that were talked about, the things that we spent time on, were signaling to students that these were indeed of some importance. So I'm going to, after pointing those two things out, come down farther where the red print is associated. And this is her response to it. So what you have in columns 2 and 3 are her response to interrogating her own assignment using the scoring guide. You'll see that she gives a yes response to that first criterion about graphs provided. The other is a little bit more descriptive. It's not quite, yeah, I did it, yeah, I didn't, they didn't do it. The analysis required, when you get down to where the red is, assignment instructions are unlikely to result in student addressing the limitations of the analysis or to clearly acknowledge the ability to be definitive is limited based upon information provided. So she's there actually trying to put herself in a position of, if I got this assignment, would I be thinking that this should be part of my response? Would I get what I'm looking for from this? And she's finding in these aspects of her responses that that's not the case. Assumptions, no, she comes out with a flat no to that. And then in terms of the instruction, she is able to talk about, is it explicit, is it not explicit? If it's not, does it need to be? So again, interrogating the necessity of what's there versus what she's expecting to get, and is it likely to prompt it? Next one, please. This is just the continuation of that scoring guide when you get to the communication. And again, instructions could provide an additional prompt for students to contextualize this. And then at the bottom of it, I had not carefully linked, this is her reflection on the whole of it, okay? So the individual pieces and now this whole, carefully linked. Now, the next thing is an example of an actual assignment that came out of that original assignment effort. This is a piece of student work. And what she has done is write comments on it. But one of the things that I want to point out for this is that she tried to link it to the criteria of the scoring guide, so that as the student was looking at it, wasn't, oh, this is not clear, da 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 da. She's pointing back to the criteria that were being looked for and helping the student connect it to the guide needs to be useful. And it is useful for her, underlining some things, making comments about them. The next one, please, is a further one where the graphical representation is included there with additional comments to other aspects of it. Next one, please. And then goes on to the final concluding part of it. Again, some comments about each, but linking it back to the scoring guide, that these two things are indeed critically important. Next one. I know this is a lot of stuff to be looking at, but I'm trying to show you, she also gave an answer key for those of us who would be looking at this and wanting to use it, so that if you're more technically connected, conversation about some of those scoring guides, I'm not an expert in this field. This is to help those who may be looking at this and trying to interrogate this to understand the process that she went through, that they have some factual information too about something that perhaps you don't know anything about. This is what was being looked for. And then you can see her comments in relation to the scoring guide. So it's an effort to allow this to be used out of the discipline as well as in the discipline by people who want to look at the process of using the scoring guide to look at a specific piece of student work. Okay, I want us to have some time here to do question and answers too, and there's a bit more. She decided then to revise her assignment. Next, please. This is the revised assignment. And when I first looked at this, I thought, oh my God, the assignment is now twice as long. It's going to be twice as much work to get through this, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that I found so fascinating about it is that in terms of the scoring guide, if you're going to be using a scoring guide, she elaborates how her assignment is now explicitly addressing aspects of the scoring guide. But she doesn't say in the assignment itself, oh, this is scoring guide, da 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 da. But she is doing this for her own benefit, as well as it could be useful for you sharing with students when they come in to talk about their papers and those kinds of things. So she's broken some things out, she's added some things, she's eliminated some things if you go back and compare them. Next, please. And again, I will apologize for going through this rapidly, but again, you'll have all of this afterwards to be looking at in more detail if you want. So again, she looked at the student work. She came back to her questions about were the criteria addressed in the assignment's grading rubric, and did she teach it? And what you see is there's a lot of yeses now that the criteria were addressed. She still has the red printing, the red text that say, I could do more here. There's some things that I think I might want to look at some more. In terms of the criterion of it being covered in the course instruction, whether it's through text or actual instruction, she's got much more in terms of the yes categories there. If you go on to the next one, it picks up the bottom of the scoring guide for the communication piece of it. And again, a summary piece at the bottom of it. The work, she concludes, was better. She, again, is looking at the overall finding of this. She's now got more specific information of what are the pieces that were there. But again, now she's saying, she said the work was better that the students submitted on the whole. Should there be scaffolding as you move through a term, not just through a degree program, et cetera? How much of that? When is the appropriate point, et cetera? So again, it's that interrogation of back and forth, and then testing it, and then doing the analysis again in the application to the new environment, the new work that's being presented. Next one, please. And I know that there are some questions which I'm not really getting to all of those, but the grading rubric. She had a scoring guide, but she said, I want to be able to go through my students' work once and be able to gather the information that's being gathered through the scoring guide, much of which she was having to use for internal and external purposes to report on how well her students were doing in her class and in her program, for accreditation, for whether it's disciplinary or institutional or departmental or college or whatever. But also she wanted to be able to assign it a grade. And again, we saw Uh, in the examples that Kathy and you were working with in the breakout rooms, it can be connected to grades. And so this is how she took the scoring guide and the outcomes that she was looking for, more disciplinary content focused in the criteria, and just created descriptors of what those equivalents would be looked for in terms of determining a grade for this, as well as the categories of the grading scoring guide itself. And so again, you can go to the next one, and what you will see is she has integrated her specific course goals and outcomes that she's looking for that are more disciplinary content related with the scoring guide, and allowed her to go through it once, but come out of it with both the more meta analysis of the with the guide and the more specific rubric for the grading that was there. All right. Let's go through the next couple slides very quickly. This is just your standard feedback loop that many of you are familiar with, but keeping students in this, I think, is critically important, along with the faculty, the program, the college, and the reviews that are there, but then how it reflects understanding of changes in the appropriate learning taking place. Again, this is just a reminder. The last slide that I have here is around the assessment cycle, which I think most of us are very familiar with, that again keeps the integration here and the connection that allows for the grading, individual focus things to be there that one needs, as well as the meta, and how it does require continually improving. It's not that it's good or it's bad. Does it align with what the learning that we're looking for is, and is the learning occurring? And if not, we need to revise. It's not a failure, it's an opportunity guide in that case. But I'll also, in terms of resources here, I didn't include at the time, again, sorry, advertising here, AAC&U, through the learning outcomes and rubric work, also engaged an international group of faculty and other educators to put together what they call ADD. We like our acronyms, assignment, design, and diagnostic, that lays out a process that one can be used to do what Bonnie Orcutt was doing. Bonnie was doing it before AD was developed, but she also actually participated in the production of that thing. And it may be a useful thing for you to use and to share with your colleagues. So I'm going to stop there, so we at least still have a few moments here for talking about questions or things and answering some of the questions that I've been talking over.
So questions for Terry. We can stop sharing at this point and look at each other again. Questions for Terry on the revision of the assignment. And if not, then I'm going to move us, for the little time we have left, to think about what advice we would give to anyone, including ourselves, about designing a scoring guide that works. Yes, it's ambitious. We want it to work. People can speak up or they can use the chat, whichever works. And Kate's got a Padlet with examples. That's great.
Very good.
And the URL is right there. So Terry, we'll start with you. What advice would you provide?
Well, I think guides are exactly that. They're guides. And so they have to work for you. And that's why, Kathy was showing us several different guides, because those presumably worked for those institutions that had developed them. So it's not a cookie cutter kind of thing. And so it's always guides are always going to have, I think the ones that work the best are always going to have some of that tension. And if they don't have tension in them between meta or larger or holistic kinds of things and more analytic, more focused kinds of things, it's not probably doing what it's supposed to do, because no guide should ever be set in concrete. It has to continually evolve because our students continually evolve. We evolve. Our disciplines actually evolve, even economics, as we're seeing in today's news. It's nobody knows what's happening and how to fix it. And so, what we've been teaching is rock solid stuff, isn't. So anyway, that's what I would say is it needs to work. And it needs to work for your faculty and your institution. But if you lose sight of having it in a larger context of higher education or your discipline or whatever, it needs to be there. And I would just finally say, I think language is indeed important.
Yeah.
And you have to think about who your students are, who your faculty are, and what is the learning outcomes that you're after. Because the language has to honor those things, but not focus on everything that's wrong. I mean, that's, again, part of what we're seeing the remnants of the implications of now in our society more generally, is the focus has been on what's wrong rather than on what could be done, what could be good, and how to build on the good that's out there and the things that work. So that's where the evidence comes in.
Makes perfect sense. And several of the comments in the chat are speaking to the value of putting the guide in dialogue with student work before the guide is rolled out as a guide.
Yes.
In fact, Christina talked about starting with student work. Do you want to talk about that, Christina?
Sure. I think it was helpful for us to look at examples of students' work in two ways. One, it started a conversation about the assignments that our colleagues were inviting students to do in their courses, and how those assignments, as Terry, you just illustrated, how those assignments are speaking to, effectively or not, the learning outcomes that you're hoping to cultivate and the performances you're looking for. So it started the conversation about what we're asking students to do in our courses. And then being able to look at those performances and talk about the language of that learning outcome, which, a good learning outcome is a short learning outcome, which means there's a lot of meaning to be read into it.
Yeah.
And so those conversations sort of came together: the assignment, the performances, the rubric, the learning outcomes, and then we were able to start thinking about what language might be included for a rubric.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful example that you describe of why we need some of that ambiguity or that openness as well, because it's not all going to be heard or seen or received by our students in the same way. And so providing enough opportunity or range or openness for students to see themselves in it. Our challenge then in an assignment is how to pull that out in connection to where we want our students to go. And that becomes another part of the challenge. But yes, that's I think is so much right on target there.
Yeah, and I'll also say that in a classroom setting, one thing I always do is share the scoring guide ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
So students see it. And I will say that in my experience, students are very quick to say, we didn't actually do that. And so you're holding me, and accountable to work that you didn't actually provide for us. So it's a healthy corrective. And we've got to come in the chat to exactly that point, introducing an assessment rubric by having students apply it to past student work. Which is a great idea.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah, no, it works really well. Students gain both an appreciation for the, what it takes to grade for faculty member. But I also find that they're much harder assessors than faculty are. So, but it forces them to look for those things, and also so that they know in advance, they really pay attention to what it is that's expected of them, but it works really well.
And
Plus, it gives them an example. So it
Yeah.
brings the rubric to life.
Yeah, and I try to give them like a range of examples as well. So
Yeah.
one that's not so great, one that's, meets, and then one that exceeds if that's possible.
Yeah, and I think there's something else here that I think is really important about this, which is that we're talking about guides or rubrics that have outcomes. One of the things I've always liked about outcomes, the way I tend to think about it, is that, outcomes are like Rome, and many roads lead to Rome. So it's really important to see the multiple ways you can get to Rome, right? I mean, you've got different kinds of models doing different kinds of things. And they can all meet the outcomes, even if they're meeting them and by taking different paths, by including different artifacts. I mean, one of the things about portfolios that make them so attractive is that they allow us to personalize education for students, but they only allow us to do that where students participate. I mean, that's part of it too. So I think there's something here about making all of that information available to students so that they understand the nature of the task that they're engaged in. That's what I would say.
The idea of like hidden curriculum and making the implicit explicit. That's kind of our mantras.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's.
And also because some of our colleagues who work in digital ethics are here, you would not be sharing student work without the permission of the student
no.
to share the work.
Oh no, that would be we asked for student permission. Not to worry.
I'm sure you did, but I had to put that in there because I was thinking back to when I was an undergraduate, and one of my professors, I said, well, this wasn't clear. I didn't know that was what we're supposed to be doing. And he said, yes, that's right. He says, the good students will figure it out.
Great.
I thought, now that's a really ethical thing too to take, I mean, that's an approach. So we do want to interrogate what we're doing with various lenses in mind. So
yeah, absolutely.
I'll just add back to Christina's comment. I really like that kind of back and forth work. Also using student work to kind of fine tune things. And I have actually changed some of my learning goals and outcomes based on the top student, the students' essays or products that I really valued. And I tried to look at several different kinds of students' work and find a common denominator about what is it that I actually did want and didn't realize or didn't put in writing. That's what I wanted, because I see it now and that's absolutely what I want them to do.
Yeah.
Then that cycles back and helps students, I think. Otherwise, it's almost like having a really competent student in a peer group, right? A discussion group who kind of socializes or leads the students into figuring out what the targets are. But so I do some of that. It's sometimes painstaking, but it's super helpful.
Yeah, I think I'll say that I think both as a classroom teacher, but also as somebody who works with programs, one of the things I find it very important to do is debrief after I've used any kind of a scoring guide, because per Terry's comment, we're always changing, we're always trying to get better. So, what is it in the scoring guide that really seemed to work well here? What are students telling me, collectively about what's working? And then where is it really not working? It's not capturing the work that they're doing very well, and so it needs to be revised, or it's punishing them for something that really wasn't, their responsibility because they were not supported. So I think building in that reflective exercise at the end of using a guide is an important part of the process, and it keeps us all aware as well.
This is such rich conversation that's happening, but we are 1 minute over time.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Rachel, very much. Thank all of you for hanging in. It's been a long but a productive day. Thank you very much for attending the session. I know that Terry and I are both smarter and wiser as a consequence of your contributions. So thanks very much. And we'll see you at some other sessions, I hope.